The crystal chandelier of the Grand Prague Hotel lay shattered on the marble floor. Elite billionaires in custom tuxedos cowered behind overturned caviar tables, screaming in absolute terror. In the center of the devastation, standing over the whimpering, broken body of Bohemia's most powerful tech mogul, was Jan Marek Novak, the Devil of Prague. But the most terrifying man in the city wasn't holding a weapon. Instead, he was delicately balancing a slice of red velvet cake on a silver platter, bowing slightly as he handed it to an elderly black woman. "Is this enough frosting for you, Babichka?" he asked, his voice softer than silk. She patted his scarred knuckles with trembling, weathered fingers, completely unbothered by the chaos surrounding them. Broken glass glittered across the marble like scattered stars. Somewhere behind them, a man was sobbing. Another was begging. Neither sound reached her ears. Or if it did, she simply didn't care. She'd seen worse. She'd survived worse. And the dangerous man kneeling before her? She'd once pulled him bleeding from a gutter when no one else would dare touch him. "A little more frosting next time," she said, simply taking a delicate bite. The corners of Jan Marek Novak's mouth. The same mouth that had just delivered 3 devastating words that collapsed and ended his empire, curved into something almost boyish, almost innocent. Every man still conscious in that ballroom held their breath. They had heard the legends. They had heard the legends, had feared the name. But none of them had ever seen this. The Devil of Prague, completely undone by one small, sweet, unimpressed grandmother. If seeing a Plato's arrow, ruthless monster become a gentle protector for the black woman who saved his brumment, life makes your heart swell. Then you belong in our family. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. If you believe a grandmother's love is worth going to war for, would you risk everything for the person who raised you? Let's dive into the story. 6 months had passed since the Vipers gang made the last mistake of their collective lives. They had come for Jan Novak with 30 men, military-grade, weapons, and the arrogant confidence of those who had never truly understood what they were hunting. The few who left it all with broken hands and a terror so deep it had permanently rearranged something behind their eyes. The underworld received the message clearly. The Devil of Prague was untouchable. In the months that followed, his empire expanded like a slow frost across glass, silent, inevitable, suffocating. Businesses folded into his portfolio. Rivals found themselves suddenly, quietly cooperative. Politicians who had once whispered his name with contempt now answered his calls before the second ring. Prague's criminal architecture had been completely redrawn, and every line led back to one man. Tonight, that man was adjusting his cufflinks in the back of a black car, staring out at the glittering entrance of the Grand Prague Hotel, with something close to disdain. The Millennium Gala, an annual ceremony of excess, where the city's wealthiest gathered to congratulate each other on being wealthy. Billionaires in bespoke suits. Politicians whose smiles cost more than most people's homes. Tycoons who built fortunes on the suffering of people who would never be invited within a mile of this lobby. Novak despised every single one of them. But the invitation sitting on the leather seat beside him wasn't really an invitation. It was a white flag dressed in embossed gold lettering. The elite of Prague had spent years pretending men like him didn't exist, constructing careful, comfortable fictions about the clean separation between their world and his. Tonight's envelope was their quiet, humiliating admission that the fiction was over. He had outgrown the shadows. He had outgrown their contempt. He was their king now, whether they had the dignity to say it aloud or not. His driver opened the door. The cameras outside surged forward. Society, journalists, gossip columnists, people paid to document power. They expected a conqueror's entrance. Broad shoulders cutting through the crowd, cold eyes, sweeping the room like a general surveying captured territory. They expected the monster their headlines had built, the devil their sources whispered about over expensive wine. What none of them expected was the brief, almost imperceptible, pause Jan Novak made before stepping fully inside, not from hesitation, but to check his phone. A single message, a simple one. Did you eat before you left? There's soup on the stove. The most feared man in Prague stood at the threshold of his own coronation, read those 11 words, and felt something in his chest shift like sunlight through a cracked door. He typed back 2 words, yes, Babichka, and walked inside. The heavy oak doors swung open, and the orchestra stopped. Not a graceful retardando, not a conductor's cue, a full, involuntary stop, as though the musicians had collectively forgotten how instruments worked. The crystal glasses trembled in hands. The laughter died mid-syllable. The slow, instinctive parting of the crowd. Bodies stepping aside with the particular urgency of people who understood on a biological level that something apex had just entered the room. Jan Novak walked through the silence like he had built it himself. But it was his companions that stole the breath from every throat in the ballroom. On his right arm, moving with the unhurried dignity of a woman who had outlasted every hardship life had considered throwing at her, was Edna, 81 years old, silver braids pinned with quiet elegance, wearing a floral dress she had pressed herself that afternoon, in a modest apartment 17 floors below this world. No jewelry beyond small pearl earrings, no pretension, just a woman who had seen enough of life to be completely unimpressed by its decorations. On his left walked Zuzana, 26, radiant, her braids swept over one shoulder, wearing an emerald gown that caught the chandelier light, like it had been designed, specifically for this moment. 6 months ago, she had cleaned these kinds of rooms. Tonight, she walked through one, with her chin lifted and her hand resting, easily, in the crook of the most powerful man in Prague's arm. Not as staff, not as an accessory, as family. The whispers began almost immediately, spreading through the crowd like something contagious. Behind champagne flutes and practiced smiles, Prague's finest sharpened their judgments into neat, quiet cruelties. Who were these? Women? Why would he bring them here? To this? The mafia king who had brought an old woman in a floral dress to the social event of the year. Was it madness? Or theater? Or some elaborate insult? None of them were sophisticated enough to decode. They whispered about the dress. They whispered about Susanna's braids. They catalogued every detail that marked these 2 women as outsiders, and held those details up like evidence of something. Novak heard every word. He had the hearing of a man who had survived by listening to rooms. And there was not a murmur in that ballroom that didn't reach him. His expression didn't change. His jaw didn't tighten. He simply leaned slightly toward Edna and said something, low, and she laughed. A real laugh, warm and unbothered, the kind that belongs to people who have never needed a ballroom's approval to feel worthy. The sound of it moved through the crowd like a small, quiet earthquake. Nobody quite knew what to do with a monster who could make someone's grandmother laugh like that. It happened fast, the way humiliations always do. Mr. Karel Švec, 4th richest man in the Czech Republic, founder of 3 tech empires, a man whose name appeared on buildings, stepped backward without looking, and collided hard with something he had already decided didn't matter. The champagne left his glass in, a clean arc, landing with quiet devastation across Edna's white shoes. A vintage, burgundy, probably worth more per bottle than most people's weekly wages. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Švec turned slowly, the practiced irritation of a man unaccustomed to physical inconvenience already, arranging itself across his face. He looked at Edna the way people look at furniture that is moved without permission, not with anger exactly, but with something worse. Dismissal so complete it didn't even require full attention. Watch where you're going, he said. Then his eyes traveled down and up, and the dismissal curdled into something uglier. Who let the help in? His voice carried. It was designed to carry. The voice of a man who had spent decades making sure rooms heard him. Security. He didn't look away from Edna as he said it. as though the instruction and the insult were the same gesture. Remove her before she soils the carpet. The ballroom held its breath. Every eye moved, instinctively, immediately, to Jan Novak. This was the calculus of power, and everyone present understood it. Karel Švec was untouchable in boardrooms and courtrooms and government offices. But this was the Devil of Prague's room, tonight. The question wasn't whether Novak would act. The question was how badly Edna would be humiliated on her way out. Nobody anticipated what happened next. Jan Novak went to his knees. Not in confrontation, not dramatically. He simply descended smoothly and without ceremony onto the marble floor of the Grand Prague Hotel's ballroom in a custom suit that cost more than most cars. He reached into his breast pocket, withdrew a silk handkerchief, ivory, monogrammed, and began with extraordinary gentleness to clean the champagne from Edna's shoes. He didn't look at Švec, didn't acknowledge him, didn't grant him the dignity of even a glance upward. He simply worked carefully, the way you handle something precious, his large, scarred hands moving with a delicacy that seemed impossible given everything those hands had done. Edna looked down at him with soft eyes and said nothing. Švec stood, above them both, champagne glass still in hand, his mouth slightly open, suddenly occupying the most uncomfortable position in the room. A powerful man, standing over a more powerful man who had simply chosen not to stand. The orchestra did not play. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The Devil of Prague finished cleaning her shoes and stayed kneeling, waiting for her word to rise. The silence shattered with a sharp, decisive crack. Not a gunshot, not a threat. A wooden cane connecting firmly with the broad shoulder of the most feared man in Prague. Get up, boy. Edna's voice cut through the ballroom with the particular authority of a woman who had been cutting through nonsense for 8 decades and had no intention of stopping. She wasn't loud exactly. She didn't need to be. The voice carried the way truth carries, cleanly and without effort. You are going to ruin those expensive pants on that dirty floor. She gestured at his knees with the cane, her expression caught somewhere between affectionate and genuinely annoyed. And you're wiping too hard. You'll ruin the Praitian leather. What happened next would be discussed in whispers across Prague's underworld for months. Jan Novak, the Devil of Prague. The man who had made decorated generals lose their composure, who had once reduced a sitting politician to tears with 4 quiet words, whose name was used to end arguments and silence rooms, dropped his head. He actually pouted. It lasted only a moment, that expression, but every person in the ballroom witnessed it. The slight downturn of his mouth, the almost imperceptible hunch of his shoulders, the look of a man who had been caught doing something wrong by the one person whose opinion genuinely mattered to him. He stood quickly, straightening his jacket. I'm sorry, Babichka. I was just trying to help. Well, she fixed him, with a look that probably had been perfecting itself since before he was born. Fix your posture. His spine straightened immediately, completely, like a soldier snapping to attention, except with considerably more sheepishness. Zuzana, standing 2 feet away, pressed her lips together very hard and studied the ceiling with sudden, intense interest. It was Karel Švec who broke first. His laughter came out sharp and performative, the kind designed to recapture a room rather than express genuine amusement. He looked around at the assembled billionaires and politicians, inviting them to share the joke, to help him rebuild the ground that had somehow shifted beneath him in the last 3 minutes. Is this a joke? He shook his head, smiling, the smile of a man trying to look like he still held something. The great Jan Novak taking orders from a maid's grandmother. The smile sharpened. You've gone soft, Novak. The laughter echoed off marble and crystal, and then died, because nobody joined it. Not one person in that ballroom laughed with him. They had all just watched Jan Novak kneel on cold marble and accept a cane to the shoulder with more grace than most men accept compliments. Whatever softness Švec thought he was identifying, It didn't look like weakness from where they were standing. It looked like something else entirely. Something none of them had a simple word for. Shvek was still smiling. That was the thing. He was still smiling, completely unaware that he had just stepped off the edge of something, with no bottom. He didn't know. He couldn't know. None of them could. The memory arrived the way it always did. Not gradually, but all at once. Like a door blown open by wind. Novak stood in the glittering ballroom surrounded by champagne and contempt and simultaneously stood somewhere else entirely. Los Angeles, 1995, a back alley off Crenshaw Boulevard, rain coming down in sheets, the kind of cold that gets into small bones and stays there. A boy of 8, already fluent in the language of hunger, curled against a dumpster while 3 older boys finished what they'd started. He didn't cry. He had learned early that crying cost energy he couldn't afford. He simply waited for it to end. The partings read way he waited for everything, with the hollow patience of a child who had never been given a reason to expect rescue. He never expected her. Edna had been walking home from a 12-hour shift, her feet aching, her purse containing exactly the kind of nothing that accumulates when you're supporting 3 children on a maid's wage. She had every reason to keep walking. The world had handed her enough of its own weight without asking her to carry a stranger's broken child through the rain. She stopped anyway. He remembered her hands, how careful they were, checking his injuries with a gentleness so unfamiliar it frightened him. He remembered trying to pull away and her voice, steady and certain, saying, "I've got you, baby. I've got you now." The antibiotics cost $43. He knew this because he had spent years afterward trying to understand the full weight of what she did. A woman with nothing walking into a pawn shop in the pouring rain, her late husband's wedding ring sliding across the glass counter with a sound so small it shouldn't have meant anything. It meant everything. She had stayed awake for 3 days, rocking him, cool rags, against his forehead, soft words in the dark when the fever spiked, and the boy, who trusted nothing, began to shake. She had kept him alive through sheer, stubborn love, the kind that doesn't ask permission, and doesn't require a reason, and doesn't stop. The world had thrown him away. Edna had picked him up. Novak returned to the ballroom slowly, the memory releasing him back into crystal and candlelight. He looked at Karel Shvek, this laughing, comfortable man who had never once gone to bed hungry, and felt something in his chest go very, very quiet, the dangerous kind of quiet. Edna pawned her only wedding ring to buy medicine for a boy the world threw away. If you had a grandmother, a mother, or anyone who sacrificed their own happiness just to see you smile, hit that like button to honor them right now. Tell me in the comments what is the biggest sacrifice someone has made for you. Let's get back to the story. Shvek's laughter had run out of room to breathe. But he hadn't run out of pride. That was the problem with men like him. Pride didn't respond to reason. It responded to audience. And there was still an audience here. Still a room full of witnesses to his humiliation. Still the unbearable fact that Jan Novak had not looked at him, had not acknowledged him, had not granted him the basic courtesy of existing within his attention. He snapped his fingers. The sound was small, decorative almost, but 10 men materialized from the edges of the room, with the practiced synchronicity of a security detail that had been paid specifically for moments like this. Large men, armed men, the kind of men whose presence was designed to communicate that the conversation was over, and the welcome conclusion had already been decided. They moved into position around Edna and Zuzana, like a slow closing of walls. Edna looked at them the way she looked at most things that were trying to intimidate her, with a patience so complete it bordered on pity. "Grab them," Shvek said, and his voice had found its footing, again. That comfortable register of a man accustomed to commands becoming in reality simply by being spoken. "Throw them in the alley." The ballroom didn't breathe, and then Novak turned around. It was a slow turn, unhurried, the kind of movement that has no urgency, because it has no doubt. And as he completed it, Something passed across his face. Or rather, something left it. The warmth, the boyishness that Edna's cane and Edna's scolding had briefly, genuinely drawn out of him. The softness that had confused and unsettled everyone in this room, gone. What replaced it was the thing that built his empire, the thing that made generals nervous and politicians compliant, and 30 armed men reconsider their career choices in dark alleys. His eyes settled on Karel Schweck with an expression so empty of heat that it registered as colder than anger. The look of a man performing a calculation, not losing his temper. Rage could be weathered. This couldn't. The 10 security guards, to their credit, felt it immediately. Hands that had been moving toward Edna and Zuzana slowed without instruction. Novak didn't look at them. He looked only at Zuzana, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet. Genuinely quiet, the way a room is quiet before something structural gives way. Cover her ears, please. Zuzana moved without hesitation, stepping behind Edna, bringing her hands up gently to cup the older woman's ears, bending slightly to press her lips close and murmur something soft and reassuring into the small remaining space. Edna reached up and patted Zuzana's hands, and Jan Novak finally gave Karel Schweck his full, undivided, catastrophic attention. He moved, not like a man deciding to move, like something released. The stillness of the previous moment didn't transition into action so much as detonate into it. And suddenly the careful geometry of the ballroom was being rewritten at a speed that made it difficult for the human eye to follow. The silver serving tray left the table before the nearest guard had completed his guard. First step toward Edna. Novak's grip found it with the casual certainty of someone reaching for something they've reached for 1,000 times. And the arc that followed was short, efficient, and final. The crack of solid silver meeting jawbone cut through the ballroom silence like a starter pistol. The second, guard's hand found his weapon. His hand was the last thing that worked correctly, for some time afterward. Novak was already inside his reach, already past the point where the weapon was relevant, driving the base of a crystal champagne flute into a nerve cluster, with a precision that suggested either extraordinary training or a very specific kind of experience. The man's legs made their own decision, and he was on the floor before his brain had finished processing the request to stand. Then Novak was simply elsewhere, and then elsewhere again. It was the movement that unmade people's understanding of him. Not the strength, not the aggression. Those things they had anticipated, had braced for. It was the fluidity, the way he transitioned between positions, the way water finds the next available space, without resistance, without wasted motion, without anything that looked like effort. Legs swept, wrists redirected with snapping precision. One guard reached for a radio and found himself briefly airborne. 15 seconds. 10 men. A masterclass delivered to an audience too terrified to appreciate the instruction, but it was the other thing, the thing beneath the violence that those who witnessed it would struggle to explain afterward. Through all of it, through every pivot and redirect and controlled detonation of force, Novak's positioning was never random. He was simultaneously dismantling 10 trained men and doing something else entirely, managing the geometry of destruction with a second, quieter calculation, running underneath the first. A guard fell left instead of right. A spray of champagne from an overturned table arced away from a specific direction. A shard of crystal skittered across marble and came to rest 6 inches short of a pair of white shoes. Not once, not by accident. Every single time. When it was over, and it was over quickly, Novak stood in the wreckage of 10 professional security personnel and straightened his jacket. A single button had come undone. He fixed it. Then he turned back to Edna, and his face had already changed again. The devil receding, the boy returning, as natural as weather. "Are you cold, Babichka? I can get your wrap." Schweck had backed himself against a marble pillar, and the pillar had nowhere further to go. His eyes moved across the 10 men on the floor, men he had paid extraordinary sums specifically so that he would never have to feel what he was currently feeling, and then moved back to Novak. And the calculation he was desperately attempting kept arriving at the same answer, an answer he didn't have the vocabulary for, because nothing in his 70 years of accumulating power had prepared him for this particular arithmetic. He waited for the blow, braced for it, even shoulders hunched, chin tucked, the involuntary geometry of a body anticipating impact. Novak reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved his phone. The gesture was so ordinary, so completely mundane, that it took Shvek a full 3 seconds to understand that it was the most threatening thing that had happened in this room all evening. Novak's thumb moved across the screen, with the casual ease of a man checking the weather. He raised the phone to his ear. It rang once. Liquidate the Shvek Corporation. His voice was the same, quiet register he'd used to ask about Edna's rap. Dump all his stocks, activate the hostile takeovers on his subsidiaries, freeze his offshore accounts. A brief pause. I want him holding nothing but dust in 60 seconds. He ended the call and slid the phone back into his pocket. The silence that followed had a different quality than the silences that had preceded it. Those had been held, suspended by shock or anticipation or the collective instinct of people who understood they were watching something significant. This silence fell. It landed on the room like something heavy, dropped from a great height. Shvek's phone began vibrating. Then it didn't stop. He looked at the screen with the expression of a man watching a horizon he has always trusted suddenly catch fire. Notifications cascading. Numbers he had spent a lifetime building, dissolving in real time into the kind of nothing that couldn't be rebuilt, couldn't be appealed, couldn't be reversed by any lawyer. His rapidly evaporating fortune might have retained 3 generations of carefully constructed legacy, a name on buildings and foundations and charitable endowments, a family's identity expressed in billions. 60 seconds. Karel? Shvek's knees found the marble floor. A sound came out of him that had no dignity left in it. The sound of a man who has just understood completely and, finally, that the things he confused for himself were never actually him. Novak looked down at him for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely above, a whisper, intimate, almost gentle, the way you deliver something true. No one disrespects my family. He stepped over him without looking back, returning to the only 2 people in the room who had ever actually mattered. The ballroom emptied the way luxury always abandons a sinking ship, quickly, expensively, and without dignity. Billionaires who had arrived in chauffeur-driven cars and tailored confidence were now moving toward exits, with the particular urgency of people who had remembered very suddenly that they had somewhere else to be. Nobody made eye contact. Nobody spoke above a whisper. They simply flowed around the edges of the devastation and disappeared, trailing perfume and terror in equal measure. Novak paid them no attention. He stepped over a groaning security guard with the same energy a man brings to stepping over a puddle, aware of it, mildly inconvenienced, already thinking about something else. His breathing was completely steady. His jacket was straight. The only evidence that anything had occurred at all was the quiet wreckage, arranged across the marble floor behind him like a very expensive still life. He reached the dessert table. It had survived the evening untouched, which felt appropriate. An island of normalcy in the wreckage. The silver platters still gleaming. The carefully constructed tower of macarons still intact. The red, velvet cake sitting precisely where it had been placed by someone who had arrived hours ago with no idea what kind of night this would become. Novak studied it briefly, with more genuine attention than he had given any person in the room. He selected a slice with the same careful consideration he brought to everything that mattered, centering it on a fresh silver platter, adjusting it slightly, then adjusting it once more. Then he carried it across the ruined ballroom, past the overturned tables and scattered glass, and the remains of Karel Shvek's empire, both literal and financial, and stopped in front of Edna. She was exactly where he had left her. Of course she was. The monster stepped back behind whatever door it lived behind, and the boy walked forward. Something in his face opened up the way it only did here, in this particular radius, in the presence of the only person who had ever seen him before he became anything worth fearing. "I'm sorry for the noise, Babichka," he said, offering the plate with both hands, a slight bow in his posture that no boardroom had ever to received. "Are you ready to eat?" Edna considered the cake with appropriate seriousness. Then she looked up at him with eyes that had seen 8 decades of this world and chosen repeatedly and deliberately to meet it with love. Zuzana looked at the ruin of Karel Schweck, still crumpled against his pillar. Then she looked at her brother, silver platter in hand, waiting patiently for an elderly woman's verdict on dessert. She smiled wide and real, and completely unguarded. Some things didn't need explanation. They just needed to be witnessed. Novak proved that true power isn't about the money you have or the fear you cause. True power is about who you are willing to kneel for. Family isn't just blood. It's about who was there for you when you had nothing and who you will protect when you have everything. If this story moved you, share it with someone you consider family. Leave a comment with the word loyalty if you watched until the pen's very end. Subscribe to Slavic Legends so you don't miss our next adventure.